Good evening. Welcome to the inaugural Bible Beer Consortium in Austin. Thank you all very, very much. First and foremost, I want to thank the Crown and Anchor and Eric right there. Everyone say thank you loudly. I want to thank Robbie Zacharias, International Ministries, and those BBC Faithful Remnants. I normally ask if this is your first event, but yes, we'll just say yes. We started this 4 years ago in Dallas-Fort Worth with me and 20 friends, and now we've seen crowds there of 600 and 700. So thank you for coming tonight. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Joe Vitale, is Dean of Studies at the Zacharias Institute and itinerant speaker for RZIM. Prior to joining the U.S. team, Joe was a speaker for RZIM Europe, where she also served in teaching and pastoral roles at the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. During her years in Oxford, Joe graduated with a first-class degree in theology from the University of Oxford. Joe then completed an MST in Biblical Interpretation and a doctorate in Old Testament studies, both at the University of Oxford. Her doctoral dissertation was on the subject of women and beauty in the Old Testament. It was also in Oxford at St. Adele's Church that Joe met and married Vince. Since joining RZIM, Joe's spoken internationally in a variety of contexts, including universities, churches, schools, conferences, and radio programs. She's also been involved in leading several week-long outreach events at universities in America and the United Kingdom. With her background in biblical studies, Joe has a particular passion for speaking on questions of biblical reliability, challenges to the question of God, and judgment in the Old and New Testaments, and the uniqueness of Jesus Christ in a world of competing truth claims. Although a UK national, Joe is now based at Zacharias Institute in Alpharetta, Georgia. Speaking tonight to the topic, Why Would a Loving God Judge People? Please welcome Dr. Joe Vitale.
Hi everyone, it's my privilege to be here with you. Being English, I've spent a lot of time in pubs, but usually they're not quite as sunny as this one, and we drink our beer at room temperature, so I think you're all weird. But you know, some of you may have heard that someone called Joe Vitale was speaking to you tonight, and maybe in your minds you were picturing a kind of loud, outspoken Italian-American from New Jersey. If that's the case, then I'm sorry for any confusion. I understand why you would have been confused. That's actually my husband, Vince. I get myself confused sometimes as well, like when we were on our honeymoon together, and we had this hypothetical conversation about what we might call any of our children. What would we name them? And so Vince suggested, well, what about Joseph? That's a nice name. And I said, no way. We can't call our child Joseph because then he'll get nicknamed Joey Vitale, and that is way too mafia sounding. Now Vince just stared at me, and then he started to laugh. And finally, a few seconds later, I caught on and I exclaimed in horror, oh no, that's my name. I'm Joey Vitale. I don't look like my name. But this is something we do all the time, actually, isn't it? We make assumptions about people based on their name or where they're from, or the rumors that we've heard about them, sometimes before we've actually even had a chance to meet them. And in no scenario is this actually more true than when it comes to rumors that we hear about the God of the Bible. Last year, I was chatting to an agnostic stranger that I just met on an aeroplane. But when I told him that I was doing my research in the Old Testament, his immediate response was, oh, you like all that fire and brimstone stuff, do you? And let's be honest, it's not like the New Testament gets it any easier. As the outspoken atheist Christopher Hitchens once put it, to terrify children with the image of hell, what good is that for the world? And perhaps it's no wonder that just last year, a new book was published by the atheist Dan Barker, which is called God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. But let's face it, in our culture today, the Christian God is facing something of a PR challenge. Now, after living through the politics of 2016, that's a concept that will be familiar to many of us. In fact, just last year, the Oxford English Dictionary, where I'm from, chose post-truth as its word of the year. But when we're living in a world like this and the culture we're in, where phrases like fake news and alternative facts have become very familiar to us, How are we supposed to believe anything that anybody says to us, let alone figure out anything about what to believe of God? And what God are we even talking about? Are we talking about the good cop God or the bad cop God? Are we talking about sweet baby Jesus? Or as Jim Carrey puts it in the movie Bruce Almighty, the God who is a mean kid sitting on an anthill with a magnifying glass, and I'm the ant? Is this a God who yells at us, or a God who embraces us? Is this a God of love, or a God of judgment? Because surely those are two very different things. So how is it then that Christians always talk about God as if he's both one and the same, and yet they claim that they're not contradicting themselves, and nor is their God two-faced? How can it possibly be true that a loving God would judge us? And if he does, how can he possibly be the kind of God that we would even want to know for ourselves? Now, with the rest of our time together, I want to suggest to you 4 reasons why, contrary to what popular culture tells us, a God who judges us is exactly the kind of God that we can and should desire to worship. And the first reason that I want to look at is this: God takes sin seriously. Now, I can guess what you're thinking. Wow, Joe, way to go, you're making friends already. Seriously, that's where you're going to start with sin? Don't you know that sin isn't even a politically correct word anymore? Well, trust me, I'm European, I do know that. In fact, just last year I was speaking in a small village in the middle of England. And while I was speaking in this village, there was a 70-year-old woman who'd been attending church every Sunday of her life, who approached me furiously after the talk. And she pointed her finger straight in my face and she said to me, "I'll have you know, I've never sinned a day in my life." Isn't that amazing? She'd been to church her whole life, but sin had nothing to do with her. Now, in the original New Testament Greek, the word for sin is actually an old archery term. It literally means to miss the mark, to fall short of a target. These days, this idea of sin, it's tough for us to get our heads around because as a society, we really don't take sin very seriously at all. In fact, like that old lady, I think we have difficulty admitting, to be honest, that we've ever done anything wrong at all. Vince and I realized how ingrained this perspective had become when he, as an American citizen, had to take a citizenship test to stay in the UK where we were living, which is ridiculously hard, by the way. I took 15 practice tests and I only managed to pass 2 of them, so apparently I'm not British enough to live in my own country. But in this paperwork, one of the questions that Vince had to answer no to in order to be allowed to remain in England was the following question. Have you, we're just going to wait for this noise to pass. You can take a sip of your beers while we pause. So Vince had to answer no to this question in order to be allowed to remain in the UK. Have you or any dependents who are applying with you ever engaged in any activities which might indicate that you may not be considered to be persons of good character? Isn't that crazy? It was basically asking him to say he'd never done anything wrong, and if he ticked yes, he would be deported. Apparently everyone in England is very well behaved. But you know, perhaps it's not surprising that we like to see ourselves this way, because academic studies show that actually in nearly every area of life, human beings have an inflated sense of self. In fact, around 90% of people rate themselves as better than average, which when you think about it, is a statistical impossibility. And the same can be said of our behavior too. We consistently believe that we're doing so much better than we really are. Although ironically, we don't actually have any trouble recognizing other people's faults and failings. And if you don't believe me, just try bringing up politics on Thanksgiving. Awkward, I won't be doing that again. But if I asked you to write down all the ways that others have... Is Billy here? No. Okay, sorry, he's vanished. But if I asked you to write down all the ways that others have wronged you in the last day or week or month or year or decade, I bet you could very quickly come up with a substantial list. But just pause for a moment and consider what others might have to say if they were writing a list, and how would you feature on it?
So my foot's not strong enough.
all the words you've spoken, all the choices you've made, all the things you've done or left undone. You know, we like to think of sin as other people's problem, but the truth of the matter is it just doesn't work that way. The Russian author Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who served in a Soviet labor camp for 8 years in the 1940s, said it this way: "If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere committing evil deeds and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the hearts of every human person. And who is willing to destroy a piece of their own heart?" I was recently reading my 2-year-old goddaughter an English children's nursery rhyme. I don't know if you know it here. It's called Humpty Dumpty. In case you don't, this is a poem about an egg called Humpty Dumpty that's sitting on a wall, and then he falls off the wall and he breaks. Now, admittedly, it's not an overly sophisticated plot, but the message itself is quite profound, and this is how it goes. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty together again. The end. How brutal is that? They couldn't put him back together again. And that is a story that we tell our 2-year-olds. And yet, at a deeper level, I think the truth behind this story is actually striking. Because Humpty Dumpty is the story of every one of us. It's the story of the human condition, that we've fallen off the wall and we're lying in pieces, and as hard as we try, none of us can put ourselves back together again. The Bible describes it this way: all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We've broken trust with God, we've broken other people, and in turn, we've broken ourselves. You may look around you at the events of this year and last year and think that the world is in pretty bad shape. Quite honestly, I believe it's much worse than we think. God takes sin seriously. Secondly, the reason that God takes sin seriously is because he takes justice seriously. Vince and I were at a dinner party a few years ago speaking with an agnostic woman, and quite far into our conversation, we asked her a question about whether she believes hell exists. Now, don't worry, that's not a question that we usually go around asking people at dinner tables, but it just happened to come up in that conversation, and intriguingly, this was her response: "Well, I don't know, but I sure hope there is. I don't know, but I sure hope there is." What an unexpected reply. It definitely wasn't what I thought she was going to say. You know, I think many of us feel the exact opposite. We really struggle with this idea of a God who judges and a judgment day because we've bought into our culture's view that love and judgment are opposites. After all, if God is so loving, then why doesn't he just forgive everyone? Isn't that what we've all been taught to do ever since we were children? So why then can't God practice what he preaches? This was actually a question that I myself used to struggle with quite a lot until something happened one day that radically changed my thinking on this issue. And the trigger was actually a few years ago when one of my friends went through the horrible trauma of being raped, and seeing her deal with the consequences of that, seeing her live with the guilt and shame over something that she had no reason to feel guilty for, and seeing the way that she began to hate her body and would punish herself by not eating, and the way that she would go from one messed up relationship to another because ever since that day she just can't cope with the idea of intimacy. You know, to be honest, there are just no words to describe the horror of that, or how devastated and angry I felt seeing her this way. And how badly I actually wanted the man who did this to her and who got away with it to be held accountable for what he'd done and to receive judgment. You know, and that's when I realized, if I love my friends so much that I cannot stand to see any of them mistreated, then how much more angry would a God who loves each one of us more than we can possibly imagine be when we hurt each other? You know, some of you here tonight may have been treated very badly, and that actually matters to God. We think of love and judgment as opposites, but actually the two go hand in hand. It's precisely because God loves each one of us so much that there has to be judgment for the ways we wrong each other. If he didn't judge, he'd be saying he doesn't care about the ways you've been hurt. Now, during that same conversation with the agnostic stranger on the plane, he actually brought up the atrocities that Islamic State had been committing in Syria. And then to my surprise, he said this: I suppose when it comes to justice, I'm a little bit Old Testament. Sometimes our society can be so wishy-washy, but we have to open our eyes to the fact that evil is real. This reminded me of the words that the Yale theologian Miroslav Volf said. And he said, I used to think that anger was unworthy of God. Shouldn't God be beyond anger? But my last resistance to the idea of God's anger was a casualty of the war in former Yugoslavia, the region that I come from. 200,000 people were killed and over 3 million were displaced, and some of them brutalized beyond imagination. And I could not imagine God not being angry. How did he react to the carnage? By doting on the perpetrators in a grandfatherly fashion. Wasn't God fiercely angry with them? Though I used to complain about the indecency of the idea of God's anger, I came to think that actually I would have to rebel against a God who wasn't angry at the sight of the world's evil. Because God isn't angry in spite of being love. God is angry because God is love. You know, when you love someone, you cry out for justice, because you just can't stand to see them hurt and do nothing about it. And actually, this reality hit home for me just 3 weeks ago when I was speaking at an event on UC Berkeley's campus on International Women's Day. As you can imagine, this day is a big deal at Berkeley. There are a lot of women outside protesting. But right in the middle of it all, surrounded by hundreds of people who were walking past, there stood a girl who was wearing fishnet tights and a short skirt, and she was completely topless, and she had a paper bag over her head with the eyes cut out. And all these people, as they approached her, you could tell people didn't know what to do. Some of them would laugh awkwardly, and other people would just kind of put their eyes down and walk on by, just not looking, because they didn't know what to do with this public spectacle. But then as you got closer to her, you could actually read the words that she'd written on the paper bag, and the words said this: all 5 of my rapists are getting away with it. And then you looked into her eyes, and they were just haunted. And one of our team had the chance to go up and speak with her, and she just listened to her. And eventually the girl just threw her arms around her, and they just stood there weeping in the middle of the square in Berkeley while everyone else was just watching on and not knowing what to do. But you know, when you see things like that, truthfully, rather than asking the question, how could a loving God judge us? It makes me say, how could a loving God not judge us? Because human justice so often fails, and I thank God that divine justice won't. The Bible describes the day when God judges the world in this way. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. This is a God who hears the cry of every victim and who won't turn a deaf ear to them. To those of us who haven't been victims of serious injustice, the idea of judgment may seem severe, but to the billions of people around the world who are victims of the most brutal forms of injustice every day, actually it's the belief that one day there is a God who will ensure justice is the only hope that they cling to, as they cry out with the very same question that Abraham asked in the book of Genesis: will not the judge of all the earth do right? God takes sin seriously. God takes judgment seriously. And thirdly, God takes relationship seriously. A few years ago, one of my good friends had given up on love because she'd just been through so many disappointing relationships after each other that she decided it would be better off if she just stayed single. Now, during that time, she moved to Florence, where she was writing a book. But while she was there, she suddenly met this great guy from Mississippi, of all places, who seemed really interested in her. However, she was careful to keep her distance, putting up barriers because she was scared to get hurt again. But one morning, while she was getting her usual cappuccino at her favorite coffee shop, the waiter came over to her and brought her a beautiful Gerber, a daisy, which is my friend's favorite flower. And from then on, several times every week, whenever she went to different coffee shops or restaurants around the city, a stranger would come up to her and they would deliver to her one of these daisies. And even when she moved back from Florence to California, where she's from, and returned to her local Starbucks, the first morning that she walked in the door, someone handed her one of these Gerber daisies. Literally everywhere she went, the daisies were following her. Now, gentlemen in the room, I hope you're taking note. This is an awesome way to impress a lady. It's slightly stalkerish perhaps, but it's pretty awesome. You know, this guy she met, he wasn't pushy. He didn't force her to do anything that she didn't want to do, but neither did he give up on her. Instead, he was persistent. He went out of his way to show her day in and day out that he was thinking about her, that he desired her, and that he thought she was worth pursuing. It's one of my favorite stories, especially because these days the two of them are married, and it's great to see them together. But imagine with me for a moment that despite the constant flowers, my friend persisted in rejecting her suitor. And imagine that this went on for years and years with flower after flower, and she continued to say, no, I am not interested. And what if one day her suitor had had enough of rejection? And so finally he decided to take matters into his own hands, and when she left her house one morning, she found herself snatched up by strangers, carted off in a van to a church, shoved in a wedding dress, marched down the aisle, and forced to make her vows to this man she'd been rejecting with a gun held to her head. Now, would you consider that to be a love match? And would that make for a happily ever after? I think not. Why? Because for love to actually meaningfully exist, it has to be freely chosen. Sure, technically the two of them would be married, but what kind of marriage would that be? You know, often when people ask the question, why would a loving God judge people, and particularly, why would a loving God judge people by sending them to hell, as we often frame the question, I think it's because they fundamentally misunderstood what heaven and hell are really like. I think often we picture heaven as something like a vacation at the beach where we all just kick back on our sun lounges sipping tropical drinks. But actually, when the Bible speaks of heaven, it describes heaven as so much more than just a place we go. Instead, heaven is primarily a relationship that we step into. As Jesus himself says, and this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you've sent. Or listen to these words from the end of the Bible in Revelation. Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. According to the Bible, heaven is to be in relationship with God, to know him intimately and to live with him, which is actually why at the end of the Bible, heaven is described as a wedding feast, because in human terms, marriage is the closest we can get to imagining the depth of relationship that we will actually get to have with God in heaven. This isn't a solitary vacation. We're not going to get our tickets into heaven off of God and then go our separate ways. No, we're actually going to live together for eternity. When we wake up in the morning, Jesus' face is going to be the face that we see. To be in relationship with God is precisely what it really means to be in heaven. And so when you picture heaven in these terms, it actually allows us to reframe this whole question. Rather than asking what kind of God would judge people, or more specifically, what kind of God would send people to hell, I suggest that actually a better question should be, what kind of God would force people into heaven? What kind of God would force intimate relationship upon those who don't want it, who've rejected him? And I would suggest to you, not a God of love. Like my friend with the daisies, God persistently pursues every single one of us. However, what he won't do is hold a gun to our heads, no matter how desperately he wants us. It's not that he desires to be apart from any of us, to be in hell, but rather hell is the only logical possibility for those who reject God. Now, you might wonder, when faced with a choice like that, who wouldn't choose God? But actually, this is something that people do all the time. Just pause with me for a moment and ask yourself this question. If this were all true, would you want it to be? If God were real, would you actually want to know him? Because I think for many of us, this actually isn't an easy question to answer. Friedrich Nietzsche said it best, if there is a God, how can I bear not to be him? You see, if God does exist, then that means we have to put him first. And more often than not, to be honest, we'd rather put ourselves first. We don't want some God to come along and start messing with our lives. We're quite happy as we are. Thank you very much. And so the Christian writer C.S. Lewis puts it this way, that what it comes down to is there are only two kinds of people in the end. There are those who say to God, thy will be done, and there are those to whom God says, in the end, thy will be done. Or as Satan so defiantly puts it in John Milton's epic poem, Paradise Lost, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. But is it? Is it better to reign than to serve? Well, I guess that all depends on what service looks like, and what that will come down to is what kind of God you're serving. One of the similarities between Islam and Christianity is that Islam shares the same conviction that for there to be justice, there must be a day of judgment on which day God will determine who receives salvation. However, within Islam, this isn't a belief that inspires anticipation, but rather fear. Some of my friends were not long ago speaking with a Muslim taxi driver as they were driving along, and they were talking about faith and sharing different ideas. And then they asked him how he felt about Judgment Day, to which he replied that he was terrified. And then he added this, ask any Muslim and they will tell you that they are terrified, because we never know if we've done enough. You see, in Islam, good and bad are weighed as if placed on a set of scales. And if the good outweighs the bad, then you're okay. But if the bad winds up outweighing the good, then you're in serious trouble. The Quran says it this way, and every man's work we have fastened to his neck, and on the day of resurrection we shall bring out for him a book that he will find wide open, and it will be said to him, read thy book, sufficient is thy own soul as a reckoner against thee this day. And he who follows the right way follows it only for the good of his own soul, and he who goes astray only to his own loss. And no bearer of burden shall bear the burden of another. When it comes to Judgment Day, there's no one who's going to intercede on your behalf or help you carry the weight of your sin. On Judgment Day, it is every man for himself. And I can see why the Muslim taxi driver would be terrified. Because if people have to carry the burden of their own sin, and no one can help you clean up the mess that we've made, then who could possibly stand before a perfect God and not be weighed and found wanting? This brings me to my fourth and final point. The Christian God takes love seriously. Earlier, I mentioned the children's nursery rhyme Humpty Dumpty as an illustration of the depth of our brokenness and the unfixable mess that we're in. But the writer Ellis Potter notes that actually for the Christian, there is one very important line that is missing from this nursery rhyme. And the line is this: Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty together again. But the king could. But the king could. And who is this king? He is the God who loves each one of us so much that he cannot bear to stand by and watch his children be wounded and hurt. He is absolutely committed to justice. And yet at the very same time, he alone is the God who loves each one of us so much that he cannot bear to see us pay the ultimate price that justice demands for the ways that we have wronged and abused each other. And so what then does the king do? He gets down off his throne and he serves our sentence. Christianity defines love in this way. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. At the cross, we find the same God who is judge of all the earth, refusing to condemn us to the fate that we deserve. Instead, God declares the judgment. He condemns himself in our place, and Jesus literally switches places with us so that the judge becomes the judged. And in return, the only one who never sinned, Jesus Christ, gives us his innocent status so that when God looks at us, he no longer sees our guilt. Instead, because of Jesus, he sees an innocent person. In that sense, the cross really is the ultimate paradox. It's the strongest and most overt statement God could have made that actually every single one of us is not okay. And yet it also signifies the triumph of life over death as God himself makes us okay. Justice requires judgment and love demands mercy. And it's only at the cross that we see the love of God and the justice of God perfectly displayed in full measure. In Islam, no one can carry the burden of another. In Christianity, it's God himself who carries our burden. Just try to get your head around that for a second, because actually it's kind of mind-blowing that the same God who created the universe is strung up on a cross, bleeding out and gasping for breath. One writer puts it this way: the world takes us to a silver screen on which flickering images of passion and romance play, and as the world watches, it says, "This is love." God takes us to the foot of a tree on which a naked and bloodied man hangs, and he says, "This is love." The Christian God is a God who loves us so much that actually he does everything possible to give us the hope of heaven and a real relationship with him. And actually all he asks us is that we choose him back, that we accept that, and then we're forgiven and freed, and actually our lives are changed forever. When my friends explained this to the Muslim taxi driver they were in the car with, he wistfully responded with these words: "It's a beautiful story. I wish it were true." It's a beautiful story. I wish it were true. I wish I could believe that God was really like that. I wish I knew him in that way. And yet I wonder how much those words resonate with many of us in the room when it just somehow seems too good to be true. Because although the response that God asks of us is so simple, "I'm sorry" and "thank you," for many of us, actually receiving love can be the hardest thing of all. You know, after years of studying and researching and questioning and thinking, I've come to a place where I don't doubt for a second that Jesus is the Son of God, and I believe with all my heart that God did raise him from the dead. But forgiveness for someone like me, no condemnation for me, no more beating myself up about the bad choices I made this morning or yesterday or 3 years ago or a decade ago. I met my husband Vince at a time in my life when I was struggling with a lot of guilt over some very bad choices that I'd made. And I just felt so unworthy of love. And I was convinced that actually if Vince knew the truth about me, he definitely wouldn't want to be in this relationship. And so preferring to get ditched sooner rather than later, I decided to tell him about my past mistakes before our relationship got too serious. But as I told him, I was so ashamed that I actually couldn't even look him in the eye. Instead, I just stared at the ground as tears just streamed down my face. And after I told him, he gently said to me, "Joe, look at me." But I couldn't bear to, because I was so scared that if I looked into his eyes, all I would see would be disappointment and judgment and rejection and condemnation. But then he said it again. He said, "Joe, look at me." And then he took my face in his hands and he raised it until we were looking eye to eye. And then he said to me, "That is not who you are anymore. That is not who you are anymore." And in that moment, that was, to be honest with you, when I think I finally really got it, when I really understood what Christianity is all about. Because looking into Vince's eyes for the first time, I understood how God sees me. And actually, it's exactly the same way that he sees the girl with the paper bag over her head and the haunted eyes, as he looks on me with just a heart and eyes full of love. Sometimes we can be terrified to look at God because we're scared to encounter the bad cop. We're frightened of judgment and anger and rejection. But when we meet him at the cross, and when we encounter for ourselves the all-encompassing love of a God who would actually die for us, then regardless of who we are or what we've done, it's as if God takes our face in his hands and he raises it until we're looking eye to eye with him, and then he says over us and to us, "That is not who you are anymore. That's not who you are." All your disappointments, all your doubts, all your failures, all your shame, everything you ever did and everything that was ever done to you, all of it isn't yours to bear anymore. It's his. You know, and you could spend your whole life searching for a love like that, for forgiveness like that, for healing and freedom like that. And to be honest with you, people do. They do. But you won't find anything else like it anywhere else. This is a God you don't need to wake up with in the morning and wonder how he feels about you or how he's going to interact with you that day. because he's the king who literally died for us just to put us back together. The Bible says it this way: therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. In other words, that is not who you are anymore. Thank you so much for listening.
We are now going to transition to Q&A. That microphone right there is for your question. Q&A is very simple. First and foremost, have a question. I know, mind blown. Make it less than 2 minutes, please. Make it germane to tonight's topic. If you can stay within that, we welcome you to the microphone. Would also ask, depending on what you've consumed, you might speak your question to your friend before you go live on live stream. Just putting that out there. So, that said, Joe has friends that she is going to introduce, and then we will start.
Great. Oh, is this on? Oh, can you hear me okay? You hear my lapel? Great. I just want to introduce you to two of my co-workers who've kindly come and joined me for the Q&A tonight. So on my left, I have Michelle Tepper. She's also a full-time speaker for Rabbi Zacharias International Ministries. Yeah, big it up. So I thought you might have trouble with my accent, so I brought a Florida girl for you just to help it out. She was wearing cowboy boots earlier, but she swapped out, so we're trying. And over here is Andy Moore. Andy is a friend of mine from across the pond. He also over from Ireland, Northern Ireland, so don't blame me if you have trouble understanding what he's saying, but he's also a speaker with Rabbi Zacharias International Ministries. We're here with a team of people in Austin this week doing a whole series of events on different topics, and so it's really wonderful to be here with you. We're going to move into the Q&A, I believe, now, around the topic I was speaking to earlier on how could a loving God judge people. So if you have questions on that subject, I know some people arrived late, so don't worry if you missed something and if you need us to clarify again, just come up to the microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, so I showed up late because I thought it started at 7. So my question is, in like 3 sentences or less, why would a loving God judge people?
Oh boy. That's always my nightmare. As someone who did a Ph.D., that's always my nightmare question. Like, how do you sum it up? Okay, so my 4 points were: a loving God would judge people because he takes sin seriously. Sin is a big deal. He would judge people because he believes in justice. He actually cares about the victims, and when we wrong each other, a loving God would step in and do something about that. He wouldn't just sweep it under the carpet. I said a loving God also cares about relationship. He takes your choice as to whether you want to know him seriously, and that affects where you wind up, whether you're in relationship with him. He's not going to force you into something that you actually don't want to be a part of. And a loving God would judge people actually because he's a God of love, that he doesn't judge in spite of being loving. He judges because he is loving. But in Christ, what we see at the cross is actually this beautiful display of the justice of God and the love of God just perfectly intersecting as God actually judges the world. He says, what you've done isn't okay. Like, actually, it's a strong statement of saying that this is not right the way you've lived, and yet he says, I'm gonna bring the sentence, but then I'm gonna step into it myself, and I will serve it for you because I actually love you too much to let you pay the price that your sins would deserve. So that was in a nutshell what we were talking about. Thank you for the question. Sorry, a couple more than a few sentences, but you get the gist. Follow-up question.
Hello? Okay.
Hello.
So I have a question. So I'm a Christian and I love Jesus, but what about people? How do you answer this question, or how do you tackle this question? People become Christians and things start happening in their lives and they get really frustrated with God. God, why are you doing this? Why are you letting this happen? And they walk away. How does God judge those people? Like, do they still go to heaven or what?
Yeah, great question.
Thank you very much, guys. It's great to be with you as the token leprechaun for the night. It's good to see you. I get to speak in some parts of the world. It's my first time coming to Texas. I'm so pleased to be here. And I've got to say, there's not many chances you get to have a pint of beer whilst you're listening to talk and then go and, do this. Is a great thing that we're doing this evening. And thank you, sir, for your question. And so if I understood you correctly, what you were asking is what happens when people become Christians and go on for some time, but maybe after some years actually turn away, and what happens then? And that is a very difficult question. And I'm not going to pretend to be God and tell you the answer to that. That is a matter between God and the person's heart. And when people become Christians, we're told that they're given a new identity, that there's a new birth into a spiritual realm, which is as real as their birth into the physical realm. It's something which undeniably has happened to them, and that a transformation of their character takes place from there. And for that reason, I don't see how people can become unborn. It may be that as the journey of them growing up in their Christian faith, and maybe the journey of discipleship is what we would call it, is very difficult, and there are challenges along the way, and you might question what has happened. But if it is truly the case that a new birth has occurred in that person's life, then I think that is something that we can have confidence that that person will find their way to that eternal relationship with God. If you're speaking something quite personally and you've got a friend or a family person in mind, then maybe we can have a little chat about that later on, and we can delve into some of the more personal things that might be connected. But hopefully that's a helpful start to that particular issue. Thank you, sir.
Guess we covered it all.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
I can't reach the microphone, but I can talk loud.
Yeah.
A lot of friends, people that I know at church, will talk about the issue that they grapple with over what about people who haven't been exposed to God. This is a big problem for my daughter and people college age. A lot of her friends really struggle with this. So, what's your response to that?
Sure, so that is a really, really great question, and that's totally linked in to this idea of how could a loving God judge people, because how loving does it seem if this God who says the only way to get to him is through knowing him through Jesus Christ, but what about all of the people in the world that, according to us, and from our point of view, how are they going to get to know? They're not sitting in a pub in Austin hearing a great talk that's laying it out for them. Some people are born into families, cultures, places that will never hear. And in fact, we're going to be speaking on a lot more of these topics this week. So grab one of the flyers and join the conversation later on. What I like to ask when people ask me those questions, first off, is generally people who ask that question never fall into that category. And I think it says two things. I think that there's many of us that hear about this God of love, this God who has reached out, and yet, at least for me, some of the biggest issues I have with trusting that a God of love that is presented in Christianity is real is that I compare him or think of him in either the best or worst version of a person that says they're loving that I've ever met before. And even the best version of someone that I've met that reaches out, that says they're loving, that says that they accept me all of the time, they're not always just. They're not always loving. And they don't treat everybody exactly the same. And I think most of all of our problems with God, whether you fall into a Christian framework or whether you've distanced yourself from it on purpose or just don't come from the culture, has to do with what Voltaire said, that we have a God who made us in his image, and then we have returned the favor. And so first, I think that we ask this question mostly once we've already heard. So we have to put ourselves in the congregation. Well, I've heard now claims. So then what are the claims that have been made tonight? What are the claims of this loving God who is just? He's not just a God who declares himself loving once. He's a God who is timeless, who the Bible, in the book of Romans, the New Testament, says that all of creation, when you look out and you see this beautiful sunset outside and you stand and wonder, it whispers a story of a creator, eternal God that is reaching out. And that this God is a God who's not far off, who's personal, that through all time and history has been reaching out in different ways in nature, in science, in music, in art, through people saying, I'm real and I love you. But because we are human beings and we tend to get things twisted, let's be honest. Just to clear things up, he said, I'm not going to just leave it so you see beautiful hints of justice and mercy and truth in different society and arts and media. I'm going to leave those hints all throughout history, but then in a fixed point in history, through Jesus Christ, is what the Christian worldview says. I'm going to come in a tangible, historical, evidence-based way to show you not only that I do really exist, but the character of who I am, that I'm a God who pursues humanity. They didn't just leave people to try to find me if they're lucky enough to be born in the right culture, sitting in the right pub, hearing the right title. He came in history, and he showed the character of a God that would reach out to people that said, actually, I don't want you to reach out and say, I will make the ultimate sacrifice to keep reaching out, even if you push me away. And then it didn't end with a tragic love story. He rose again. Now, as crazy as that sounds, in a couple weeks, we are going to be celebrating around the world a God who came back from the dead. And why do we celebrate it? Maybe just for a chance to eat lots of chocolate, but maybe because there are some pretty good, arguably hard to push away, evidences in history that this actually did happen. And so we answer with maybe another question going, don't just believe that this God is loving. Maybe this God who showed himself in history not only to exist, but showed himself as a character of a God who's forever reaching out and forever pursuing and forever revealing himself. He revealed himself once, and he continues to reveal himself in other ways. If that's the God Jesus showed us is who he is, then that's a God that though we can't get our heads around how everyone will have the opportunity, we can trust the reliability of what we've seen in Scripture, in nature, in history, and in Jesus Christ, that God is always reaching out. And every hungry heart that seeks him, he will be found of them.
I love what Michelle just said. I think one thing I just wanted to kind of reaffirm what she was saying is that actually I think part of the struggle with this question for us is we're so very localized, and we only know what the church or Christianity looks like in the particular area where we are. And so if you're in a culture where it seems like, less people are going to church, less people believe than they used to, it can be very easy to feel like, where is God? But actually, one thing I've learned throughout my Christian faith is actually God is always doing way more than we think he is rather than less. And what I find amazing about this period of history we're actually living in now is that, we look at things like the internet and we think, oh no, they're in certain ways, it maybe hasn't been the best thing for culture, but look at the opportunities that it has provided in other ways. So, for example, more people than ever before are having the chance to encounter who Jesus is because of the internet. In fact, the place that the Bible is read more in the Middle East than nearly anywhere else in the world right now, because the first time people actually have access to the gospel and they're downloading it and reading it in Arabic. And if you could see the numbers, they're actually staggering. I just love this story of God's creative. I think what I love about the Christian faith is he allows us to play a role in it. He lets us be a part of sharing about who he is, because he's like an inclusive parent who wants to involve their children, but he's completely capable of doing things without us when we can't get to certain places. One of our colleagues on our team, actually, her aunt and uncle were traveling in a country in the Middle East, and I won't say where it was, but they were giving out Bibles while they were there to people. And as they were traveling along the road, they saw this guy standing outside you call them gas stations, gas station. It's not a petrol station. He's standing outside a gas station. This guy carrying a huge gun, and he just looked like this massive bodyguard, and they were intimidated by him. And the wife said, we need to give that man a Bible. But the husband was like, no, there's no way we're giving this guy a Bible. Just drive on. He's going to shoot us if we go anywhere near him. But this wife just kept going on, and then she started praying in the car. She said, Lord Jesus, let this man's blood be on my husband's head, because I wanted to give him a Bible and he refused, and it's all his fault. And finally the husband was just guilt tripped into basically going back and driving back and giving this guy a Bible. And he approached him very nervously. But then as he did, and he just said, here, this is for you. And he handed him the Bible. And this guy just fell to his knees and just started weeping. And he said, 3 days ago I had this dream. And in the dream I just saw a figure come to me. And and he was kind of glowing, and he told me that he was God, and that I needed to go and stand at this petrol station, and in 3 days' time someone would come and give me the book of life. And I've been waiting to see if someone is going to come and give this thing to me, and I didn't think anyone was coming. So all that to say, God is beautifully creative, and what I love about that story is it shows that God is reaching out. He reaches out in so many amazing ways, and yet at the same time, that couple were involved in it too. And I think that's the story we see, that God is at work through us, but don't assume he's doing less than he actually is, because he's so gracious, he's so loving, and he will always reach out further than we can possibly imagine. So I find hope in that actually the judge of all the earth will do right, that he will be just, that if it comes down to belief in Christ, then he won't judge us on anything but the opportunity we have to say yes or no to Christ and who he is. Another question.
Reading this for someone, quote, "How is it just for someone else to suffer the consequences for something wrong that I've done?"
Well, I'm certainly glad that it's possible, because I couldn't pay the price that I owe. When I was a little boy, me and my little brother, we used to play soccer, or football as the proper term would be, out in our back garden, and we invented a game. We wanted to practice our free kicks, where you would have some target practice, and we used to say 5 points if you can hit Dad's satellite dish, 1 point if you can hit the clothesline where Mum's hung up some stuff, and 10 points if you can hit the top window. Now, I was about 10 years old when this game started. My brother was about 8. Now, I don't know how much damage you think it's possible for a couple of young chaps to do of an afternoon, but let me tell you, my father would know the answer to that question. We destroyed lots of things that day. And suddenly, I've got an angry father who I'm struggling to have a good relationship with in the face of what I've done. I know that I really am sorry, but I've got no way of fixing the satellite dish. I'm 10 years old. What am I going to do? My source of pocket money is £3 a week and an extra 50 pence if I eat an apple at some point during the day. I've got this huge debt which I cannot possibly pay. And yet I need to be reconciled to my father. And I am now. I'm reconciled to my father. This was many years ago. There was damage done in our relationship, and somebody had to pay the price. It couldn't be me, and my father did it for me. And that is the heart of the Christian gospel, where we have a debt, where we cannot pay it ourselves. And whilst we might think there are questions about the fairness of that, I'm certainly happy that that's how it works. And actually, if God is the judge of all, and it's his world that we live in, and it's he that sets the price of falling short, is the word that we've used for sin this evening, then his justice can be perfectly exercised in the way that he can do it through the cross. His love is shown there. And so I'm certainly glad that that's how it works. And if there's anyone here who feels that they have got some debts that they can't pay, and there's the offer of someone to do it for them, then I think it's some beautiful news that we can rejoice in and accept it for ourselves. That would be my response to that. Thank you.
Take another one? Okay, so a lot of people I know struggle with this issue of they see people who are feeding the hungry, opening their homes and letting people who need a place to stay come in and stay. They're spending their time and their money and their resources helping those in need, and they don't profess to be Christians, and they're yet living their lives much more Christ-like than people who call themselves Christians do. So how would you explain how a good God would judge those people who are living like a Christ-like, living like Jesus would say to live, and yet, just if they're not professing to be believers in God, how could God judge that? So does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Thank you. I really thought it was so helpful when Joe outlined earlier that difference of conception. We think of what is heaven and what is hell. What are the results of this judgment? And it's unhelpful to think of it a place where there's lots of terrible things happening, lots of fire, etc. It's more helpful to think of it in the way that it is actually expressed in the Bible, which is the kingdom of God. That's what heaven would be, a place where people have chosen relationship with God, and they find themselves there in that relationship for eternity. And for those that do not wish to have that relationship, then God honors them with that wish not to have that relationship. The C.S. Lewis quote about two types of people that when they arrive at the pearly gates, either God will say they will say to God, "Thy will be done, and I submit to your kingship. I wanted you to be my king for the 60, 80 years that I had on earth. It makes sense for me to want to continue under your kingship for the rest of eternity." And then others who will say, God will say to them, "Thy will be done. I didn't want you as king for 60, 80 years on earth." It's almost a little bit illogical, irrational for them to want to have God as king for eternity. From that point, it doesn't make any sense. And so there's a real honoring of what our decisions are on earth. And the way that you phrased the question, it reminds me of the parable of the prodigal son, which is told in Luke chapter 15. And you've got the two sons who both represent this two types of relationship that you can have with the Father. The first, which is the son that we know most about, I think we talk about him most, is the one that goes off to a far country and lives a wild life, spends all his money, gets into a bit of trouble, and comes back and says, "I want to come back into the Father's house." But he only says, "I want to come in and be a servant." He doesn't actually want to live in the status of a son to his father. But the father says, "Come on in anyway, we'll have a party." And then if you remember what happens in the after that, there's this other son, the older son, who spent his whole time at the father's house, tending the sheep or doing whatever it was that Middle Eastern farmers did at the time, being a good person, welcoming people into their homes, none of which expressed any interest in being in a relationship with the father. And so both of the sons, in their equal and opposite ways, had both not quite got the point that it was all about knowing the Father and just being in relationship with him, enjoying what it was to them to be sons. And so it is possible for all of us here to be wonderfully, amazingly good citizens and to do all of these beautiful charitable acts. But the question is, where does that take us to? Do we end up in relationship with God, or is it kind of an expression of our own desire to be righteous? And that sounds a little bit more like a kind of Islamic approach to judgment, which is where I want to make my good deeds outweigh my bad deeds. And actually we forget the grace which is available to us through Jesus and on the cross and in the Christian gospel. So that would be a starting point in response to that. And Luke 15 and that story is really helpful to me as I consider that important question. Thank you for asking it.
Just to say as well to that question, what I love about that is the challenge to the Christian, actually, and it's the recognition that we've got a job to do for people to see love in our lives. A few years ago, there was a survey in the UK, and it came back that the greatest obstacle to the Christian faith in the country where I'm from was that people saw Christians as hypocrites. That they would look at Christ and he seems so loving, but then they would look at the Christian church in our lives and they would say, why don't these two things match up? One of the things that our boss, Ravi Zacharias, always says is, don't judge a philosophy by its abuse. Often we don't live up to the calling as Christians that God has called us to, but boy, should we be going after it. And people do look at your lives. In the New Testament, it talks about our lives being letters lived. People read our lives. They look at the story you're writing and they say, is that something attractive? Why would I desire that? Why would I want to be a Christian? And they're watching you. So how do you live? Does your life reflect what you're called to? And another thing to say, if you know people like that, and I know so many amazing atheists, Christians do not have a monopoly on being good people or nice people. I know people who love so well, and I admire them and I look up to them. But it's an opportunity when you know people like that who love really well and who care about people to actually engage in a conversation there. And it was fascinating to me being at Berkeley 3 weeks ago, because I thought it would be a very hostile place to be talking about Christianity when I spent the week there. But actually, to my amazement, I had some of the best conversations I've ever had with all of these students. And I think the reason was because at Berkeley, people are absolutely passionate about social justice. These are students with a cause. They care about the world. They have this strong sense of wanting to make it right, of wanting to make a difference. And yet, when we push the conversation despite being very intelligent students, they couldn't actually explain why it was that they cared so deeply. And actually having the chance to say, well, where do you get this strong sense of right and wrong from? Why do you care so much about good and evil? You know, if it's a purely naturalistic view of the world, and so many of them were relativists, they would say there isn't really a right and wrong, you just kind of, you know, it's what you decide as a culture, it's what you decide as a person. But then where's this sense of, this deeply ingrained sense of justice? And I was speaking with one of them and I said, you know, if you, we were talking actually about the question of rape because it was on International Women's Day and all of this was going on, and you know, and looking at this girl who'd been through so much pain and saying, look, even if the whole world said that was okay, why is it then that you would still feel like, no, that would be wrong? It's not just about consensus. In our hearts, I really do believe that we have an innate God-given sense of right and wrong that could only come from a lawgiver who is God. So where does that sense of justice come from? And secondly, why do you think humans are worth anything? You know, again, from a naturalistic framework, like why do we care so much about people? Isn't it really about survival of the fittest? If you can treat people however you want, doesn't strength win out? Why do we have this sense that actually there is an equality that we strive for, that people have value regardless of how well they perform or how good looking they are or how rich or successful they are, that actually the person who has been through terrible suffering and maybe, you know, is differently abled is as much of value and worth as, you know, the top athlete? Like, why do we have that strong sense of equality? And if not for the idea that actually we're created in the image of God. And I love that that's where the Bible begins. It says that male and female, that we were created in his image. And that means not only do we have equal value, but we have huge value and significance because we're made in the image of a God who is love, and therefore we're sacred. And that was actually what my friend said to the girl who, you know, had been through that terrible trauma. She said, I'm so sorry that this is so, what happened to you is such a violation of something that is so sacred. And how precious she was to God. So I think if you have people who really care about social issues, that's a beautiful thing. And I think it reflects the heart of God because we're created by God to love each other. But it's just taking it a step further and saying, where do you think this comes from? Why do you care so much? Could it be that you're made this way because you're made in the image of a triune God, a God who is Trinity, who from the very beginning has always been a community that loves the other and preferences the other and creates out of an overflow of love? Like, where does this come from? So just an opportunity there, if you know people who think that way, just to kind of say, yes, you're on the right track, but why? Why do you care? Oh, should we?
Sorry, it's me.
Oh, I was just saying, do you mind if we come back to you? Because there's someone who don't think has asked a question. Thanks.
Okay, so as Christians, we believe in the final judgment, that in the final day, God will judge the good and the evil. But we also see stories in the Bible where God healed people and he said, go and sin no more. So we see that sickness as a sign of judgment. And the reason for this question is because I talked to a friend yesterday and she said she got sick and she said, you know, I think God is judging me. I have been very judgmental about someone and I think this is a sign of, you know, God is repaying me. So my question is, if that's true, that God deal with us, not only in the final day, what are the signs? How can we know God is judging us?
I think it's a really good question, and one of the things I want to say to that is we see this question asked of Jesus, actually, in the Bible. Part of what I love about Jesus so much is that so many people asked him questions, so many people that were from outside his framework, people that were not culturally appropriate according to his day, or economically appropriate, or religiously appropriate. And people were always asking him questions. He didn't point them or push them away. We see two things. First, there was a man that was born blind, that the Bible talks about Jesus healing. And religious people of the day, pointed him out to Jesus and actually said something similar to what you just said. So it's a common question of God. You know, obviously he's blind because of something he did or something his parents did. This is some sort of judgment that God has put on him. And Jesus actually not only corrected that and said, you know, you're basically judging based on tradition or judging based on what you think you would do or judging based on what you have heard. But this is not what I'm talking about. This is not God's love reaching out. And so he took spit in the dirt And he actually healed this man that was born blind as a sign that he loved this man, that he was of value, and also as a sign for all of the world that we are living in a world that is broken. If it were, it's broken, yes, because we have all walked away from the way that God intended things. That's the story from the garden all the way through. So in a sense, we're all living out the judgment of God in the effects that we have because we're living in a fractured relationship with a God of love. When I'm trying to explain love and when I'm trying to explain sin, which, as Joe says, not only a politically non-correct concept these days, but a hard concept to understand. I have a 7-year-old daughter, and we're often talking about things like this. When I'm talking about this to my daughter, I talk to her about sin and love and God based on relationship. If we claim that this God of the Christian worldview is completely love and completely light, then it would make sense that if we say no to him, as Andy and Joe have said tonight, if we say my will be done, this God of love, this God of light, he doesn't change. But if you take one step away from light, it's always going to get a little bit darker. If you take one step away from goodness, suddenly there's evil. And so we are all living, as it were, under the judgment of all of our choices across all of time, taking steps away from this God of love and judgment. And yet this great God who is true love, personified, a God who lives this sacrifice, like Andy talked about, with a father that goes, you're my child and you'll never be able to pay. And this, in a sense, like some of our parents have said, well, you get what you did. You deserve this because you stepped away from me. He goes, I'm not going to just let you live there in a mess, if that's what you created, or what other people think your family have created. I'm going to reach out and say, not based on what you've done, whether you've lived everything right or everything wrong, I'm going to reach out. We see God reaching out either in that story in the Bible, saying, actually, this man did nothing wrong. This is just the effects of brokenness in our world. And I'm going to prove to you, I'm not judging him or punishing him, and I'm going to completely touch him and completely heal him. So first off, I want to speak to you and your friend and anyone, because I know I've lived under that mindset before. Something goes wrong. Oh, God, what did I do wrong today? But I think it was Bono who once said, there's basically 2 religions in the world. It's grace and karma. And many of us live under this, whether we realize it or not, this karmic lifestyle going, if something goes wrong in my life, obviously I've deserved it. Fate, the gods, something are reacting against it. But the Christian God says, no, I'm a God of grace. I'm a God of love. When you walk away from love, you're going to feel the effects of brokenness because that's what happens. But I will continually reach out to touch you. So Jesus was always confronted with this. So we live with the effects of our brokenness, but I wouldn't say, and I don't like to say, that is God reaching out going, your friend got sick because she did something wrong. We do see, though, and this is the other message in the Bible, that God does reach out, and especially when his people, like Joe has said tonight, sometimes, we're the ones, if you identify with the Christian faith tonight, that give the worst rap to God ever. We live like hypocrites. We don't love people in a way this loving God did. When his people that are living in relationship with him specifically are walking away from them throughout history, we do see that God says, look, I'm going to hold you to account. I'm going to stir you. I'm going to, if the word conviction is not very popular these days, but I'm going to, stir in you everything you know of me so that you're more aware of this relationship that's broken right now. And so he does, I think, sometimes reach out more specifically to his people when we are living in ways that when we're identifying with him publicly, but not actually living that way. But I think that it's not him smiting us, oh mighty smiter, as Joe once again referenced Jim Carrey. I think it's that we're more in tune with him. And so when we're stepping away from him, we can feel it more. Just like when you're in great relationship with a family and something suddenly happens. When my daughter, we have a great relationship, and she reacts wrong to me, or I react wrong to her because we're in such close relationship, even if I react right as a mother, I don't freak out in the grocery store for once in my life when she runs away or knocks something over. She feels it more acutely if I'd said, don't touch that, and she turns and goes, and knocks it over. Even if I say nothing, she feels it more acutely because our relationship's so close. She actually came over to me recently. Now, this is a very small sin, if you can even classify it. This is the personality of my daughter. I was the rule follower growing up, always checked all the rules. She's exactly the opposite. We went to the beach together the other day because it's summer in Florida, although it's pretty nice here after the storms, right? And I love the beach, but I hate the sand. I know that's crazy, right? So I have all my towel. I don't want any sand on it. She's 7. She loves the sand, but she knows Mommy doesn't like the sand. We get up. She goes, let's go for a walk, Mommy. I'm like, okay, that's great. I get up. I straighten it. She looks at me. She ran across my towel and dumped sand on it. She goes, I don't know why I did it. I'm really sorry. I just had to. I didn't freak out, although I have in the past because I'm silly like that and I'm broken unit. But she immediately, instinctively felt that she did something that she knew that I didn't like, that I had asked her not to, not because I was going to freak out because she got sand, because she knows me, because she loves me. So I want to hold those two things in tension. We don't serve a God of karma. We don't serve a God that goes, you know what, you stepped out of line, I'm going to smack you back in. We serve a God who persistently throughout history and even now reaches out when we don't deserve it. And yet those of us who really are in relationship with that God, I'd say we feel it almost immediately when we do walk outside of what he wants for us because we're in relationship with him. And when we really know real love, when we fracture that relationship, we feel it. Because that relationship means so much. So if you feel something, whether you would call yourself a Christian or not tonight, when you break someone's heart, when you're rude to someone, I believe that's because we serve this God of relationship who says you can fulfill all of the laws of God if you love me right and you love other people. So if you feel something instinctually, when you break someone's heart or you live for yourself, even if you wouldn't call yourself a Christian, I think it's again because the God of relationship is reaching out and is very close to you, saying life's about love. Life's about how much I love you and how much that love will overflow into how you love others. And if you feel it, maybe it's not because you're so far away, but it's because you're so close.
Hello. I know God loves me, and so for a long time I wasn't really reading the Old Testament, and so I started reading the Old Testament, and I've noticed that by now I'm in Nehemiah, and God's killed likely over 1 million people, and sometimes when he kills people, he doesn't want them to just die. He wants them to die in like the most horrible way possible. So like in 2 Kings 17, he lets lions run through the Israelite village and kill them so they can die the most horrible way. How does a loving God do something like that?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. I think this is, it's a big question for us as Christians. I think it's a hard one for us to deal with. I don't think you can read the Old Testament without feeling the emotional force of text like that. I struggled with this question myself for a long time. It's partly why I wound up studying the Old Testament, because I was really wrestling with the ways that kind of the immediacy of God's judgment and sometimes the way he would do it, and struggling to understand, like, well, what are you doing in these texts? Like, you know, I believe this is your word, but then I look at Jesus and I see this God who's so loving, and then I read these texts and I don't know how to reconcile these two things. And I will say that I think it's a question we need to take seriously, because I think it's a question a lot of people have. You'd be amazed how many people I meet who say, well, a Christian told me to go away and read the Bible, so I started doing that, and, you know, what about this, what about that? And sometimes, as a note to Christians, if you tell someone to go read the Bible, give them a few tips on how to do that, you know, because people just dive right in, and honestly, it's hard to know what's going on. I think the first thing I want to say is we need to be so careful when it comes to reading the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, that we don't immediately leap to conclusions based on our own cultural context. This is something I kind of learned for myself. The first time I went to visit my in-laws in New Jersey, who are Italian Americans, and I was sitting outside on the deck, and I looked back into the kitchen. I could see my husband Vince and his mum engaged in what looked like this huge argument, and the arms are flailing around. They're kind of like right up in each other's faces, and It's looking pretty aggressive, and his mum was like chopping garlic, and then she starts throwing around this huge kitchen knife whenever she wants to make a particular point, and I just have no idea what's going on, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, are we gonna have to pack our bags and go home? Do I need to run in the middle and break it up? Am I gonna get skewered in the process? Like, what is happening? And finally Vince walked away, and I went to find him, and I said, hey, like, what's the deal? Like, what was going on with you and your mum? Is everything okay? And he just kind of looked at me and he was like, Joe, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, we were just having a perfectly loving Italian-American conversation. That's just how we talk to each other. And I just realized that I had completely misread the context, even though I was someone who grew up watching American TV and had traveled quite a bit, and yet I still just totally misunderstood what was going on. And my point is this. Now, that's kind of a trivial example, but when we look at the Old Testament, we're stepping into a wildly different world. This is a very difficult kind of barbaric culture that the Israelites were living in. It's rough, it's vicious, and sometimes it's really hard to make sense of what's going on. And sometimes it's hard to make sense of, for example, the laws that God gives in the Old Testament, in part because God gives his perfect law in Genesis, and once we fall, we get something called case laws, which are kind of like provisional laws where God says, I don't want this world to be broken and full of bloodshed, but it is, because this is the reality of sin, and therefore I have to manage this the best way I possibly can. And an example of a law like this would be an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, right? We read that today and we're like, oh my gosh, this is so barbaric, an eye for an eye, like, what is the deal? And actually what we don't realize when we read laws like that is that actually that they're not to kind of say, go cut out someone's eye, but actually they're there to limit vengeance. They're there to say, if someone hurts you, don't go back and destroy a whole village, but actually things need to be proportional. Justice should be proportional. And in actual fact, we don't find a single case in the Old Testament of them actually living that out in the way you might think of actually giving an eye for an eye. It would actually be a ransom, a monetary transfer. So all that to say, there's a lot going on when it comes to the Old Testament that is hard for us to make sense of. I think what you're getting at here is the particular challenge of what do you do, not when it's about the laws of how people relate to each other, but what about when God intervenes in judgment in a way that we find really hard to understand? And I think one thing that I think is hard for us to get, because when we look at this sort of judgment that happens in those contexts, we look at it and we reel back and we say, oh, like I find that so unattractive. Why would God behave that way? But in the culture of that time, the way that people understood God to speak was very different. And actually in a military culture where it's about trying to understand this God and how he speaks in history, actually people would read that differently. People would read that in a way where they would say, oh my goodness, like actually this is someone who takes sin really seriously. And I think we also need to understand that these laws are given in a cultural context where it's not like today where we have a kind of, you have system set up where if someone misbehaves a certain way, you can send them to prison, you have the resources for that. This is a very small tribe living in a hostile world where constantly they're tempted to give in to compromises from the peoples around them and behave in certain ways that are actually not life-giving but destructive. And so God is constantly trying to preserve his people and keep them set apart from the other cultures around them. And sometimes the way God does that is in a very radical, dramatic way. But I don't believe for a second that's because God takes any pleasure out of people's pain. It says in Isaiah that actually, do I take pleasure in the death of the wicked? No, I desire that everyone will return and be saved. God isn't some kind of just sadist who enjoys that. But actually I think it's because he's so concerned for his people. And he's so concerned that if he just lets things go, they're just going to slip and slide into these surrounding cultures and behave in truly, to be honest with you, horrible ways. I mean, if you want to look at the culture of Canaan, for example, that surrounded the Israelites, and the goddess that they worshipped was Anat, who's the goddess of sex and war, and there are texts describing her as, joyfully wading up in blood that's up to her neck, and behind her, human hands are flying around like locusts. It's basically a goddess who glories in bloodshed. And this is the culture they're up against, a culture that is so destructive that God is saying, okay, I'm going to put some radical laws in place, and sometimes I'm going to behave in ways that are shocking to you, but they're intentionally shocking because I need you not to go this way, because if you do, it will be the death and destruction of all of you. One of the ways I find it easier to think about this, just to help me get a handle on it, because from our 21st century mindset, it is so radically different for us, is that actually the more you value someone, the more seriously you set up laws around them, and the more serious the penalty might be if they go astray, not because you're trying to ruin their life, not because you don't care of them, but exactly the opposite, because you want to preserve them. It's interesting to me that in our culture today, we don't have laws. You can get a divorce, you can have adultery, and no one's going to throw you in prison for that. But if someone steals your TV, we're going to take that pretty seriously and judge that. The Old Testament is different in that regard. The Old Testament values people over property. It takes very seriously things like adultery, which is why you get some pretty severe laws around that. Why is that? Actually, I think the more strict laws are around something, it says something about what God really values. And I think what God really values is his people and preserving those people, not just for their own sake because he plays favorites, but ultimately so that they would be a blessing to the whole world. I think sometimes we can zone in so much in the particular text, but we miss the bigger picture of why is God behaving these ways? What is at stake here? You might say, some might say, well, maybe God wasn't severe enough because the Israelites do go astray, things do go horribly wrong, they do wind up getting caught up in all these surrounding cultures. So how do you balance those things? You look at the wars in the Old Testament, you think, why would God judge those people that way? But then you hear, oh, he waited 400 years. Like, is that not patient to wait till they reach such a point where actually for the sake of justice it can't go on anymore? So I think a few things are going on. We're looking at it from outside of that culture. I think we don't really, even as humans, even as Christians, as hard as we try, I think it's hard for us to get a handle on what it really means that God is holy and just. And we see behaviors as no big deal that actually to him are such a big deal because they destroy life, they destroy people, they destroy relationship, and God really cares about those things. But I also want to say that actually, we do see a difference between the way that God judges with a certain immediacy in the Old Testament compared to what you see later in the New Testament. And you can see the New Testament, sometimes, they get frustrated by this, saying, God, why is this still going on? Why aren't you intervening now? And I love what it says, in Peter when it says that God isn't slow in keeping his promises, as some understand slowness, but he's patient because he wants everyone to be saved. God is, in a sense, often holding off the way that he intervenes now until the judgment day because he wants people to have every opportunity to come to know him. And of course, when we look at all these difficult texts in the Old Testament, I think we have to understand that as much as we're trying to wade through things and make sense of the cultural context and make sense of what's going on, ultimately, the full revelation of God that we have is in Jesus Christ. And if we really want to know what his character is like and what his heart is like, then that is what we need to look to. And I just find it absolutely astonishing that when you look at Jesus on the cross, like compare him to the goddess Anat who glories in shedding the blood of her enemies, and then you look at Christ who's hanging on the cross and his own children are killing him. And he looks down on them with a heart full of love and he says, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Now, I know that there are still a lot more questions we could talk about around that issue around the Old Testament, around the way that God reveals, but I would just say don't give up on it. If you find a hard text, don't walk away without digging into the context, looking at the bigger motives, the broader picture of why this would be such a big deal to God, and ultimately keep looking back to Christ, because that really is the full revelation of who God is, a God who, like I said, really is committed to justice and is committed to love. Thank you for your question.
Just one comment on that real quick. I know God loves me. I fight for it. And I used to live in a Muslim country, and I would always ask people, hey, do you think God loves you? And they would say, oh, I don't know. And I'd say, well, why do you want to go to heaven if God doesn't love you? What do you think heaven's going to be like? So I think God is awesome. I think he does love us. This is something hard to understand. Thank you, though, for your answer.
Thank you for clarifying. And, just to say, thank you very much for that. And just keep wrestling with it. I think it's good you're taking it seriously. I think we should as Christians. I think we should care deeply about the God of the Old Testament. I said earlier that that the book has been written, God, the most unpleasant character in all fiction. If you want to read a rough book on the Old Testament, read that book. But I think Christians should read it, because if we don't engage with the criticisms that are coming at us and don't understand how people are perceiving the God of Christianity, then we won't be ready for a response. We won't know what to say. So keep going for it, keep digging into it. If any of you want to read more on this subject, you want a great book, I recommend Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan, which I just think is really brilliant in terms of engaging with some of these difficult questions. Thank you. We'll go there. Yeah.
As you may imagine, a lot of us here in the South kind of prescribe to a Calvinistic type of worldview where holds the doctrine of total depravity kind of in high esteem. And I would argue the same goes for an Arminianist type of worldview, whether or not God predestines certain people towards judgment, or he puts them in the circumstance, whether or not through knowing about Jesus in the first place, or just putting them with a certain heredity or disposition or cultural circumstance where they end up not believing, and then condemns them to judgment. For example, Judas, it says that it would be better for him not to be born than to have done what he did, basically. So I'm wondering how we can fit judgment into whether God purposely does not call certain people or he just puts them in a circumstance. How can we justify hell, eternal damnation, and torment for justice for someone who didn't even have the choice to be born or be saved? Thank you.
So I'm not going to solve the Arminian Calvinistic issue in 5 minutes, just to manage expectations. This is an extremely difficult question, and the people who hold to a very strong doctrine of predestination have got good scriptural roots for that. The people who equally say, actually, human free will, human decision, human responsibility is a real and actual thing, have got good scriptural basis for that. And I wonder if there's a way in which the two things can be held together in some kind of form of tension that actually releases a kind of greater truth about the situation. And tension between ideas is actually something which you come across in other areas of Christian belief. The fact that God is three persons, but at the same time one person. It is the case that the side of that thing is true, as is the other side of the thing. It is true, and the two must be held together in order to understand the idea in the middle. The same thing when we come to the person of Jesus. On the one hand, he is fully God, the full image of God expressed on earth. God's fullness dwells in Jesus. And on the other hand, he is fully human, a man just like us, a human being like us. Those two things are equally true, and we cannot set one side of the equation down at the expense of the other. It's actually the decision to hold them together in which we understand the fullness of who Jesus is. And I would then just say that because we have this parallel track of a God who knows in advance what we're going to do, but also who has endowed us with a reality about our decisions and a responsibility for the directions we take, then we just have an idea which is something in the middle there which we can't fully get our heads around. But I tell you this, the fact that this part of the equation is real, that we do have human responsibility, that our decisions towards God do matter, then that's the bit I'm probably going to focus on and make sure I get that right. And actually there's some wonderful things about the other side of the equation. Not that it's an angry God who's created people in order to condemn them, as the way the question was phrased, but actually a God who knows everything about us before we come into existence. He knows how many hairs are on your head at this present moment, maybe less than there were a few years ago. He knows and he loves everything about you the way you presently are, and he chose to bring you into existence before the world began. He loves you the way you are. He predestined you to be the way you are. And that's a beautiful thing. And rather than thinking of God as an angry father who is waiting for us to trip up and then say, haha, I knew you would do that, and punish us, God is a father who knows everything about us and watches over us in a loving way and wants the best for us. It says he works together all things for the good of those who love him. And so there's a beautiful thing in that idea of God knowing things about us before they happen. There's a great comfort. There's a great comfort in knowing that God's providence is a real thing, that we can say, do you know what? I'm struggling right now. I'm suffering, but I know that God is doing something through this. And so these two ideas that run in parallel are both true and real. And it's important that we deal with our real responsibility towards God and the reality that we are endowed with a choice, whether or not we accept or reject him in this life. That's a part to concentrate on first and foremost, and we can read as many books on Calvinism or Arminianism as we want to after that. But I hope that's just a starting point for that question, and thank you again for it.
A number of the questions and answers that we've had kind of touch on my question, but I think mine has a little different focus. Why does a loving God allow bad things, or even we could say evil things, happen in this world of his? And there's several levels that this occurs at, one-on-one, person-to-person, or maybe groups of this group of people versus this group. Sometimes it's just ourselves. We do bad things to ourselves. And then, of course, there's like the flood in Colombia yesterday, where nature destroys a village and 300 people in an instant. So can you address that a little bit?
So I guess the root of this question is, if you are God and you've got the project of making a world, what type of world should you create? What kind of characteristics would you go for? What would make a better or worse world according to whether you made it this way or that way or the other way? And actually, the assumption in behind this question of why does God allow bad things to happen is the assumption that God should have created a different type of world. In that, things would maybe have slightly less suffering. We would all enjoy it a little bit more. And maybe God should have done things that way. The difficulty with that line of thinking, and actually this is a piece of work which Joe's husband, Dr. Vince Vitale, has developed, his Princeton thesis was around this area. The moment we say God should have created a different type of world is immediately to wish ourselves out of existence. Because just in that kind of line of thinking that I was developing when I was talking about predestination and God knowing how things would transpire so that he knows how many gray hairs or whatever color of hair you have are on the top of your head right now, God knew exactly who you were going to be at this moment in time. And there are things that have happened to you up until this point which are terrible, things which you've struggled with, suffering that you've had to deal with. But it's a comfort to know that it is exactly the version of you that God loves and chose before the universe began. Now, just coming back to the question of what type of world would God create, and obviously God, he wants to make the best possible kind of world. It'd be weird to suggest that God would go for a mediocre standard. I don't see how that would work. So God, what makes a best possible world? Well, I would suggest that a world in which real love was a meaningful thing would make a pretty good kind of world. And the point which Joe made very well earlier in her talk was that in order for love to be a real and meaningful thing, it must be freely given and freely received. If I get one of you guys up here and hold a gun to your head and say, "Do you love me?" and you say, "Yes," you don't love me. That's not love freely expressed. And so God gave us the real opportunity to receive his love or reject his love. And to the extent that humanity has rejected his love, which it has done, then as Michelle was saying, the moment you take a step back from the light, it gets a little bit darker. The moment you take a step back from that warmth, it gets a little bit colder. That's what humanity is experiencing, and the earth reflects it. We know it. We have moral evils is the technical term, the things we do to each other, the backstabbing, the betrayal, the lying, all the terrible things we do to one another. And the earth, to some extent, is reflecting this as well. The earthquakes and the different things we see. Albeit that's a different category of evil, and there's nothing necessarily bad about an earthquake. It only becomes bad when there's human beings living nearby. The tectonic plates have been moving in their own kind of morally neutral way for many millennia. It's only when human development is around them, which would just be a nuance in that kind of thing, on that kind of question. But what kind of world would God want to create? A world in which real love had a meaning, and therefore a real possibility of that love being less than perfect, and lots of things resulting from that would be a start again to the answer to that question of why God has allowed suffering to take place.
Thanks, Andy. And just to go along with that, I think there are two different ways you can kind of look at this question. One is trying to explain God's goodness in the suffering. And I think Andy did a good job of pointing to some of those things, like we wouldn't exist, if God hadn't made the world the way it is, we wouldn't be people who can freely love. And there are certain you might say another thing is there are certain meaningful characteristics and virtues that come out of humans' response to other people's suffering that you don't necessarily have the chance to develop if that suffering doesn't take place, like courage, like generosity, like love, giving someone a helping hand. But I want to again steal from my husband Vince, who speaks a lot on this subject, and that's the great thing about being married in one flesh, is you can just borrow each other's stuff. But another thing we might say is, along with goodness explained would be goodness displayed. It's the idea that we could give some arguments as to why God might allow these things, but truthfully, there's an extent to which we're wandering around in the dark here because it is beyond us and we don't see everything in full. I think from the perspective of eternity, it helps to think that actually this is just a brief flash, but actually God can make good on everything we go through in this lifetime in the long run from that perspective. But I think even when we don't know, even when we can't say why certain things happen, I think, sometimes with these big picture theories, I'm right here, but I don't think it's me. No, I wouldn't mind, thanks. But sometimes these big picture theories, as much as they kind of help philosophically, when you're right in the middle of pain, they don't really speak to your heart, do they? Sometimes you want to hear philosophy when you're theorizing about things, but other times when you're walking through grief, like actually people telling you why or giving you kind of answers like that, they mean nothing to you. They just don't help in those moments. But what I love about the Christian response to suffering is that not only does God stand radically opposed to suffering, but actually he's a God who steps down into it, a God who displays his goodness, even when we can't understand it, by coming in the person of Jesus and dying on that cross. We talked about what that meant for sin. I think another reason God would come and do that is as a response to suffering, because there's so much pain and horror in this world. It would be kind of hard to worship a God who didn't take that seriously. And so the fact that we have a God who doesn't just sit off on some high up throne and just watch us struggling, but actually says, if you're in a dark place, I'm coming right down. I'm going to go through that with you too. That gives me hope, even when I can't theorize about why it's happening, to know that actually, even if I don't understand the why of God's goodness in it, I can see the goodness because he's the God who actually hung on a cross in my suffering with me. John Stott said it really well. He said, in a real world of pain, how could I worship a God who is immune to it? But when you look at the cross, you see a God who is not immune to pain, but a God who gets right down in it. And I think sometimes when you have wounds, what you need to know is that there's someone who knows what it's like to be wounded too. There's a God who actually cares that deeply. The night that Jesus died when he's in the garden and he actually prays, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. The fact that the God of the universe could say that, could experience that, could know how that feels, means that no matter what depths you go to, maybe tonight some of you are in a dark place, maybe you've even contemplated suicide, it's that hard, but knowing that if that's where you're at, that there's a God who knows how that feels and says, I'm here with you, I won't leave you by yourself, but I've come into that place. Like, that gives me hope, even when the theory doesn't do it for me, knowing that the goodness is displayed as well as trying to explain it. That means so much. I love the poem by Edward Shillito, Jesus of the Scars. It just ends with the words, the other gods were strong, but you were weak. They rode, but you stumbled to a throne. But to our wounds, only God's wounds can speak, and not a God has wounds, but you alone.
Maybe just it's worth adding, just if there's anybody who is really experiencing something very difficult this evening, and some of these things that we've been saying do seem a little bit kind of just too out there and too philosophical, we'd love to just speak to you and offer you some friendship. And if anyone would like to pray about something they're going through, then come and grab us afterwards. It is the case that the question of suffering in particular is very rarely just one out there, but one which is in here, and we want to really acknowledge that. If there are things which are happening in anybody's life tonight, then we'd love to pray with you if that would be helpful in any way. There's a question.
There's someone really dear to me who says, I can't stand you Christians because you're so judgmental. So if we're made in the image of our God and we're redeemed and we have a new spirit, what role does judgment have in our life, in our society, in politics, in how we live out our lives? Like, what do you think about that?
I think that's a great question, and I think that Jesus spoke very strongly about people judging. I think he specifically said, judge not, lest you be judged. The measure which with you judge someone, he said, you will be judged with. Now, at the same time, I think that as a society, and we see this throughout history, not just with Christianity, we tend to go extremes, though. We go, I've been hurt by judgment, or because I'm not God, I can't judge anyone, so we're going to stand without judgment. I think that Joe presented a pretty beautiful case tonight. We see all throughout real life that true love cannot exist in the absence of judgment. That actually, let's put it down to something really, really trivial, right? If I have a wonderful lunch with Joe right before I come here, and I'm talking to her, and I bit into a great taco, because you guys are known for tacos here in Austin, right? And, all of that cilantro, is just in my teeth. And I'm here talking to you tonight because Joe, she just didn't want to judge the fact, this is a no judgment zone. I'm not going to embarrass you. I'm not going to make you feel awkward. You do you, Michelle. You like cilantro? You do you. It's fine, right? True love doesn't exist if we don't call out, hey, look, there's something blurry there. So I think that we need to not react in the other extreme and say you can't judge anybody, because true love can't exist unless we go, actually, there are some really, really true things. And if you step out from that, you're going to hurt yourself and you're going to hurt others. So because I love you, I'm going to stand beside you. I'm going to walk with you. I'll suffer alongside you while I call out saying, this is going to harm you and other people. But we have to judge the way that Jesus judged us. And we've already heard tonight, you can't judge a philosophy by its abuse. Now, unfortunately, we don't want to use that as a wild card to get out of things. But Jesus also said, he gave a pretty clear line of judgment for his people, but it was with the lens of love. He said, you will know my followers, and you'll know Christians by the way that they love other people. And so we need to judge ourselves by the law of love. And we need to judge other people the way that Jesus judged them. We see in John 8, and I know that we're getting to the end of our time, that there was a woman that was dragged before Jesus. She was caught in the middle of adultery. There's some pretty clear evidence that she had not only crossed a moral code that was very clear, but there was just, she was a woman in that time. How did Jesus judge her? He was radically inclusive. He didn't draw away from her. He reached out. He took shame away from her. He said, those of you who haven't sinned, you cast the first stone. And people started walking away. And he said, I don't condemn you either. Where are your accusers? But then he didn't just leave her there saying, this is the no judgment zone. He didn't just leave her there going, well, I hope that you just live and you can learn to walk out of the shame. He looked at her because he loved her. And he said, go and sin no more. I don't condemn you. I will draw close to you. I'll love you through any brokenness that's going to fracture you, fracture your reputation, fracture your relationships. But go and live a life of love the way I've loved. One that is a high standard, but I'll walk with you. And when you walk that way alongside me, you'll walk free and clear forever. Not just because the world or one person at one time says you're worthy of it, but you'll learn to walk in a way that way. So I think that we need to heal the wounds of others that have been judged too harshly, but we also need to live a life of love. So thank you for that. And Ezra, he's the host. So.
It's very difficult to ask this without slipping into an accent. I'm going to try. Asking this for someone, if it's a sin not to believe in Jesus, and Jesus died for our sins, are not even those that don't follow Christ forgiven in the end? One more time. If it's a sin not to believe in Jesus, and Jesus died for our sins, are not even those that don't follow Christ forgiven in the end?
I think this comes... no, I think I've got it. Thank you, sir. This comes down to a question, again, of themes that we've picked up already this evening of the true giving of love and the true receiving of love. And the example in Joe's talk was the guy who constantly pursued the girl for years and years and years with flowers, did everything in his lifetime to express his love for her and say, hey, come on. What would, in the end, if he got to the point of saying, you've completely rejected all my flowers, all my expressions of affection for you, I'm just going to take matters into my own hands, I'm just going to bring you and make you my wife. I'm going to force you up the aisle, just as Joe explained earlier. Is that any description of a marriage? Is that anything like real love? And what this question is asking then is about whether or not people who refuse to follow Christ will be saved in the end. And that would be exactly the same case as forcing that young girl to marry somebody that she didn't want to marry. There's books, the philosophical issue at stake here is called Universalism. There's been books written about this, about whether God will save everybody in the end. i.e. will he take a group of people who wanted to spend eternity somewhere else and make them spend eternity where they did not want to be? And that is not a God who would be a respecter of free will. That is not a God who would be a respecter of true love and the dynamics of how love works. So that is my answer to that question.
I want you to ask your question, and we've gone really long, but just one extra bit on that. You know, I think it also comes down to that idea of believe, because it's a good question. And I think the end of it is, well, if Jesus died for everyone's sin, doesn't that cover the sin of unbelief? And once again, in the Bible, you know, it says that, well, even the devil, even Satan, if you believe in Satan, you know, believes. And so what is belief when it comes down to Christianity? You know, belief, for God so loved the world, possibly one of the most famous verses of the Bible, that he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. To believe in God is not going, okay, well, I believe and there's enough proof that God exists. To believe in God is who God revealed himself as. He revealed himself as a God of relationship, a God who loves us, and a God didn't just poof to say, I exist. He says, I exist, I've given you evidence, and my existence is an invitation back into relationship with me. So for the Christian, believing in Jesus Christ, and what gets you that access into the kingdom, what gets you that access is saying, I not only believe that you're there, or I believe that you're giving me an offer of great relationship, I believe that you want to be in relationship with me, that you're inviting me into eternal relationship with me, that you're inviting me into a marriage, which is what the Bible talks about, the end of judgment being a marriage celebration. And my belief in you crosses not only into acceptance of an offer of eternal relationship, but actually acting on it. Saying, I not only believe that there's an offer there, but I want to follow through. Just like when my husband Peter asked me to marry him nearly 11 years ago, I could say, oh, really? Really, you want to marry me? Oh, you have a ring? Really? Okay, I believe you asked that. I believe you really mean something. And went, great. Tell everybody, hey, he wanted to marry me. He really meant it. That's amazing. That's not the same thing as me saying, I believe you enough that this offer of relationship is be faithful and true, and your character stands that I believe you enough that I'm going to cross over into saying yes and covenant myself to you for the rest of my life, for as long as we both shall live. Because I not only believe that you love me, but I believe that offer of love is good enough to stake the rest of my days on and to join you on exclusively. And so I think that that's another issue there, what belief means. Now, feel free to ask your question.
I guess my question is this. I think in regards to eternal damnation, I think in regards to moral obligation, why should people be judged by moral standards that they never agreed to in the first place? Like a case in point, if you go into the military, you basically volunteer to live under their rule and live under their rules and laws. But if you're a civilian, you don't have to live under that. So in regards to like eternal damnation and suffering, why should people be punished for something that they never agreed to in the first place? Like I think of like people in India, I think of people overseas. Why should they have to suffer in regards to that?
Thank you so much for that question. That's a really great question. So a couple of thoughts on that. Firstly, that I don't believe that right and wrong are subjective. I don't think it's a case of a communal consensus that determines what moral standards are. I actually believe that they're given by God, and therefore I think they stand regardless of what a culture might say. I mean, you know, like people talk, don't they, about the Holocaust, and you know, even if our whole culture went a certain way, that still wouldn't make it right. I think we actually need that as human beings. We need a higher standard that calls us to account. Because honestly, when we're left to ourselves, if it's up to us to determine morality and then judge ourselves on the basis of our own morality, my goodness, like what hope do we have? Like, look at the way we treat each other. Look at what's going on in the world. If we all just live according to what we think is right, you're going to have real problems. I love the way Rabbi Zacharias says it. Like, what do you do like when the rubber hits the road, when two different worldviews clash up against each other, when you have some people who say love your neighbor and other people who like to eat their neighbors? Like, it doesn't work. We need something beyond ourselves to determine right and wrong and how we should live. So I think that's kind of key for us. I also think that that sometimes we can be in a place where when we're in the middle of doing something, we're pretty stubborn about accepting that it might be wrong. You know, we're pretty good at putting our heads in the sand and saying, no, this is no big deal. I think self-deception, like I said earlier, when describing sin as a big part of our human nature, I think we can be in denial. But sometimes, there are things I used to do as a teenager that at the time I really thought were no big deal, but now looking back on those things, I can see, my goodness, like that really was a big deal. And actually, it's not just the case that morality changes, but actually I was wrong about those things then and I'm right about them now. And that's just a couple of cases in my life of things that have changed in me. And then when you picture God, like I've just come this far down the road, but if God is all the way down the other end of the road, then from his perspective, things look pretty rough and the standard is pretty different. So that's one thing I would want to say to that. But I also want to add that, you know, the idea of God just judging us on how good we've been or right and wrong, like that is a part of it. Justice is really important, but I also think, like we've been saying the whole evening, it comes back again to relationship, doesn't it? And you might say, you know, some people are born in really terrible circumstances, you know, whether it's poverty, whether it's the way they were raised, whether it's what they went through on account of their parents. You know, we're all born into different situations, and so, you know, the way you phrased it is, you know, how could you be held accountable if you don't know that certain things are wrong? Maybe it's a pattern of behavior. How could God judge us on the basis of those things when maybe we're born into them, maybe we're stuck in it? You might say, all of us, you know, we say that the world is broken and we're born into a broken world, and there's a sense in which all of us are born as sinners, and you know, you just need to spend some time with like a child to see that instinctively we're already messing things up from that age. Like, but how can we be held accountable for that? You know, if we don't know any better, if that's kind of what we're stuck with. And there's one example that Michael Ramsden, who's one of our colleagues, uses that I just find quite helpful, and he describes, imagine that you're alone in an ocean. And you're drowning in this ocean. There's no land in sight. There's no boats. There's nothing to help you. And you're struggling and flailing around and you're trying to survive, but you're at the end of yourself and you've got nothing left. And you're hanging in there, but taking your last breaths. And then suddenly God comes along and he reaches out his hand and he says to you, take my hand. I want to rescue you. Take my hand. But you say, no, I don't need your hand. I'm going to deal with this myself. I'm going to get myself out of this mess. And God is saying, no, really? Like, you're on your last breath. Like, I can see that you're struggling. You're going to die. Take my hand. I will rescue you. All you have to do, the hand is here. Just, you know, just accept what I'm offering. Just let me help you out. And you keep saying no and no and no. Now, in that situation, God isn't going to judge you for the fact that you're drowning in an ocean. Like, you know, that it's not your fault that you're in the ocean, that that's the situation that you're in. But he could rightly take seriously your decision to not say yes to the hand. And I think that's what we've been saying all night. It's you know, ultimately, what determines, you know, this issue of justice and love isn't about like how good you've been, the right and wrong, the standard, all of those things, you know. Ultimately, it comes down to, will you take my hand? That God is making an invitation, and he's actually wanting us to accept him. And, you know, we've been talking about that all night, the idea of God making an invitation. And but I guess it's no good talking about you know, this party that's happening and that all the invitations are going out unless you actually extend the invitation and say, hey, you're welcome and invited. So I just want to say, if you're here tonight, if you're listening to the live stream and you're hearing all this stuff, I just want you to know you're invited. Like, actually, that God really does reach out his hand to you. He wants to know you. He wants to be in relationship with you. And he's done everything he possibly could to reach out to you. I love the parable of the prodigal son, that when we were still far off, when the son is still far off, the father comes running after him. And I think that's what we've been talking about all night. A God who chases people down, who says, I'm coming for you. I choose you. Arms wide open. Will you accept the embrace? And so I just want to encourage you, if that's something you haven't done before, but that's the place that you're in, we'd love to talk to you further. We'd love to have a chance to pray with you. You can do that yourself, though, as well. It might be you want to say to God tonight, hey, God, if you're really there, if this is really what you're like, I thought you were one thing. I thought you were a God who was after me, who's out to get me, but actually you're a God who pursues me out of love. And that is someone I would like to know. Then just don't miss the opportunity tonight to say yes to that invitation that he has been making to you. And if you're here, we'd love to talk to you further about that as well. Thank you for your question.
How would you argue against the notion of hell being an infinite punishment? This is very similar to his question. An infinite punishment for a finite life, finite / mistake.
This was one that really puzzled me whenever I considered that Jesus was killed on the cross and was buried in a grave and rose again 3 days later. And we're told that that goodness, that thing which happened, the punishment that Jesus took on himself in that moment was the punishment which we deserved, which was eternal damnation. So how does 3 days equate to making up for that? Now, the question is really, when we're talking about God, who is by definition outside of space and time, whether space and time are the right measurements to be using. And as again, we come back to this point of relationship and this state of being, who God is and who we are to him. You know, when you consider if we are going to be in heaven for eternity, is it not the case that that's honestly at some point in time going to get a little bit boring? You know, God, we've sang this hymn, that's 22 million times now. You know, honestly, this is getting quite tiresome here. The categories of time do not apply to heaven and hell. And that is the starting point for thinking this through. It's this state of being, God who is outside of space and time, who called space and time into being, and our relationship to him and our state of being towards him. And that's why I'm talking earlier on about the state of new birth, which is possible in Christianity, where we were born into a different realm, a spiritual realm as opposed to a physical realm, and in which time seems to lose a little bit of meaning. That's the only way that we can understand eternity, is the fact that time does not apply to it. And so that is how I think that question can be approached with an answer.
Something that's always puzzled me is that the question of how much evidence God gives people, and I hope somebody didn't already ask this, but like Jesus told even one of his own disciples, if you don't believe for other reasons, believe because of the miracles you've seen. He was willing to get really strong on the evidence for that guy. But for me, I'm looking at this thing 2,000 years later with all these arguments and historical debates about how reliable the texts are. And then it's even different for somebody who's raised in a culture where everything in their culture tells them that's a bunch of bull. We believe in Muhammad, and we have reasons why we believe that, and it's like they're so far removed from the evidence. So why such different levels of evidence for different people? How does that work out? That just doesn't, it seems, why doesn't God just have a little 10-minute chat with everybody, say, here I am, I'm real, it's true, now make up your mind.
It's funny, that's a really great question, first off. And let me answer from a couple different ways. I'm a mother, only of one daughter, but I was from a family of 4. Parents are lying when they say that they treat all of their kids equally. It's just true. And partly why is that? I think because what does equal look like? If even in our earthly relationships we kind of get this, how much more a heavenly Father? This is what we keep claiming tonight. Relationships depend on different things. Different people relate to their parents, relate to different people differently. As I already said tonight, even just me and my daughter, I was a rule follower of my other 3 siblings. They hated me for it, okay? So my parents didn't need to give me that much evidence. I was just like, okay, we'll do this. Whereas some of my other siblings, they needed coaxing, they needed cajoling, they needed the 50 cents for apples and more to be able to be eating these things. Different people do need different levels of things, different cultures, different times. As we've already heard Joe really helpfully explain tonight, the way that God revealed himself to a culture, the ancient Near East, which is a warfare culture, was radically different to us from our perspective now. And yet equally, the way that Jesus came, which in a sense seems a little bit more tasteful to us, thinking that we have built most of modern society, whether we admit it or not, based on the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' precepts that he's taught. Jesus coming that way was shocking to anybody who had any type of vision of God at that time. God wasn't human. God wouldn't suffer. God wouldn't come in time. So God constantly was shocking different cultures in different ways, and I think he continues to do that on different levels today. What I'd also say is that when Jesus did come and, in a sense, have a chat 10 minutes or more with every single person around him, even the Bible, specifically the 4 Gospels. If you're not familiar with the Bible, I'm not just going to be one of those Christians that says, go pick it up and read it. Read one of the first 4 books of the New Testament called Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Those are biographies of the life of Jesus. Within those biographies, it would say, Jesus would do a miracle in front of people, and it would say, and many believed. It didn't say, and all believed. I think that, again, has to do with this relational element that we say. Some people are won over when they see something on the side. Some people see something and still will find ways to explain it away. What I would like to add, though, is that the stories that we hear of what I would say, if we can use this term miraculous in our very, I want evidence culture today, generally are coming and are happening and are documented from these cultures, like you said, that would be closed to a Western Christian worldview, where it would be harder for them to accidentally get to know the evidence of the reliability of the texts and scriptures. So what's happening? Jesus is actually breaking through in visions, in dreams, in the miraculous to these people. I have multiple friends of mine, multiple colleagues that I work with that have had to change their names, right? One of them said he would be a modern day Apostle Paul. I worked with him. I worked in Oxford for over a decade as a chaplain with the University of Oxford in a church there. And one of the colleagues I had for a while, he had to do a trip out of Africa, change his name and relocate because he was at such a high level within his Islamic faith that he, during the time of Ramadan, during a time of fasting and seeking Allah, crying out that Allah would reveal himself, began to have visions of Jesus Christ, calling out to him. In one of those visions, he got the exact location of a hidden group of Christians because in the nation that he was part of, they had to hide themselves. He went and sought that group out based on a vision. You can't really get more supernatural than that today. Why he calls himself the modern Apostle Paul is because he actually did martyr Christians when he found them. He was that high acting in this Islamic faith. When he found them, they thought it was a setup. And at first they pushed him away. At first they were afraid because they thought he was seeking them out to kill them. When he kept coming back, they had mercy on him. They believed him. He became a follower of Jesus Christ in a way that he could only say was completely supernatural evidence that reached out to him. And then he was smuggled out of the country after his life being nearly taken a few times. So God is reaching out. And I would just say that we need to sometimes tune in to the everyday occurrences that we dismiss because it's easy to dismiss and say, God, how are you reaching out to me? That if we are hungry, that we should press in and that we can be agents, as Joe already said tonight, those who do believe that there is a God and he is loving, that we can be a visible reality of that invisible God in our lives to those around us who are seeking for a reality, a real God. Now, you said you had a question back there, so I want to be able to get to it.
Just wondering if God didn't create us equal, then how can he be equal to us? What would you say to a child born with cancer and his family is religious and everything? What would you say?
I think I would just say that I completely believe in the justice of God, and I think God has a full understanding of everything you've been through. He knows your whole life from the beginning to the end. He formed you in the womb. He knows the whole story, and therefore I think God better than anyone is in a position to be able to judge fairly because he alone knows what you've been through. He knows what you were capable of. He knows that something that would be easy for someone might be the hardest thing in the world for you. He gets all of those different things. And so when we talk about the justice of God being fair, I don't think we're saying he's going to treat everyone exactly the same. But kind of going back to what Michelle was saying about parents, and understanding each child individually, God isn't just going to have a sweeping stand and say, okay, how do you measure up to this? How do you measure up? How do you measure up? Kind of like, in a factory and you're just kind of rotating through. But but God goes after the individual. He knows who you are, and therefore I think God will judge completely fairly. It says in the New Testament that, to those who much has been given, much will be expected. There's a sense in which some of us do have more privilege than others, and God knows that. So He will look at, how did you use what I gave you? We have the same sense with with the parable of the talents, don't we? When Jesus talks about that, how are you going to use? It doesn't really matter whether you're given 10 or 5 or 1, but the point is, what did you do with what you were given? And everyone is given something, and for some it seems like very little from a human perspective. From others it seems like an awful lot, but God knows, and God will deal fairly by a case-by-case basis. So all that to say, I don't think we need to worry. Is He going to be fair? Is God going to care? God gets it. God gets the suffering. He gets the pain. I love that we have the story of when Jesus looks at the widow who just throws in a couple of coins into the collection, and He says she gave more than anything. Forget about the people who gave their mountains of gold. She gave more than anyone else, because she gave everything that she had. And that just gives me hope that actually God sees what you're going through. He's very specific like that. I love the story in the Old Testament of Hagar. We talk a lot about privilege in our culture. Actually, if anyone was ever underprivileged, it's Hagar. She's a foreigner. She's female. She's a slave. She is pregnant with an illegitimate child, and she's the mistress of a married man. Literally, in ancient culture, it doesn't get any worse than that for Hagar. And yet, who's the first person in the Old Testament that has kind of a theophany, has a revelation of God, where He actually kind of shows up in a very supernatural way and speaks? It's Hagar. Of all people, she's gone into the desert to die, and she has this dramatic encounter where God brings her hope, and He promises her protection for her future despite her circumstances. And then she actually names the place, and she says, I'm going to call the place is named after God, and she says, I'm going to call you the God who sees me, because I've now seen the one who sees me. And when I read texts like that, it gives me hope, because there are people in so much pain and suffering, and we can't understand the extent of it. Even as human beings who know people well, we don't always know what they're going through. We miss things, but God doesn't miss a thing. He's the God who sees everything, and therefore, because He sees everything, I know that He looks on people with love, and He will act with justice towards them. Thank you for your question.
Final question. First, our mission statement is to present the truth of God as it is to people as they are. So thank you for doing that tonight. Question to each of you: how can we pray for you, your families, and your ministry with RZIM?
Before I answer that, let me just say thank you to all of you. What a pleasure it's been to spend the evening with you. Thank you for all your incredibly good questions, and for allowing us to offer some humble thoughts towards it. It's been a great evening. Thank you. How can you pray for me? I don't know where to start. I've got all sorts of problems. I don't know. Perhaps when I go back to Oxford, I've got some very busy things ahead of me. I'm trying to complete a degree, and I've got about 2 days to produce an essay, which is going to be evidence of the miraculous, I would suggest. And then I'm off to South Africa for another ministry trip there. I'm really looking forward to it, but again, there's going to be a lot of preparation, so perhaps a prayer for me might be some provision for getting through those very, very busy couple of days. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really appreciate this question. So my husband Vince and I just moved to Atlanta 5 months ago, and reeling with culture shock, but we moved to help set up something called the Zacharias Institute, and as part of RZIM, it's going to be an apologetics training center based out of Atlanta, but just helping resource Christians and answer a lot of these difficult questions, putting on conferences, things like that. And it's just a very big task. And I think we both feel the sort of weight of wanting to be faithful in what God has put in our hands. But sometimes it can feel so overwhelming that I think my battle in it is not to be afraid, of being in a different culture and speaking about God, sometimes in places that are hostile, sometimes places that are very friendly, as you have been tonight, and thank you for that. So I think just in general, just not being someone who fears. I was thinking about the words from Narnia earlier in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, when Aslan just says to Lucy when the whole sky is dark and she's afraid, and he just says, "Courage, dear heart." And I think that's what I would love your prayer for, just that we would have courage to step into what God is calling us to do and do it without fear, and just believe the words of the Great Commission when Jesus says, "Go and make disciples of all nations and baptize in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit." And then he says, "But I will be with you always." And I think just really knowing that God goes with us and before us, and we're in this because of him, we're doing it for him, and that's the safest place we could be. And it's one thing to know that and be able to quote it to you, but to live in that and believe that. So I'd love your prayers for that. Thank you.
And I just want to echo the thanks for such a wonderful event tonight, for you guys all coming out and bringing your honest questions. You could pray for us for the rest of the events this week. That would be really great. If you haven't heard about them, we've got some flyers here. You can go to Think Week Austin. There's a lot of other things going on. If you have further questions, come out, ask us afterwards, or come to one of our events. Bring a friend. Pray for us as we continue to do things like this. Jesus said to his disciples, "A new command I give to you, love others the way that I have loved you." That's a tall order. That's what everything comes down to that we've been talking about. So my prayer for me, which is such a gracious question, pray that as I walk around and go around the world talking about this love that's sacrificial, that it would be more than just words, that I wouldn't be one of those that people look at and say, "Why do Christians talk big and they don't live it?" And specifically, as a mother and a wife, that as I do it around the world graciously, that when I get home, I would have the strength and dignity to do it there most, and not just do it when I'm outside of it. So thank you guys so much. Please bring any questions afterwards and come to another event. But thanks for this great event.
Go ahead.
Just really want the final word from us to be, we've been talking so much about God being like somebody pursuing somebody with flowers to tell them how much they love them, and maybe it's the case that up until this point this evening you've not wanted to receive those flowers. So if there's anyone here who has just felt something change in their heart or mind this evening, and you think actually tonight might be the night when I want to say thank you to God for Jesus and to step into that relationship with him, maybe with a trillion questions still in your mind, things that you still got to work through, but you think you've heard enough to believe that this is true and that it might change your life, then come. Don't let this night pass you by. Don't let this moment leave, and come and chat with us afterwards. We'd love to just tell you what might come next.
Thank you all very much.
I have just one